Good afternoon, boa tarde, buenas tardes. My name is Keisha Khan Perry, Professor of Africana Studies at Brown University and Watufani Poe's dissertation advisor. First, I want to acknowledge that we are standing on the indigenous and various indigenous territories that are throughout the Americas. For me, it's Rhode Island, and for some of you in Sao Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, Philadelphia, and other cities throughout the Americas. So first, it's important to acknowledge that. Also, this is intended to be a joyous occasion. This is not your typical, this is actually not a defense. So in recent years, the Africana Studies Department at Brown decided to hold closed dissertation defenses in which we could have very productive conversations with the PhD candidates about how to revise their dissertation for publication as book manuscripts. So on March 15th, Watufani met with myself and his dissertation committee members, Professors Jerry Augusto, James Green, and Marlon Bailey, and successfully defended his dissertation. So congratulations to for that. And our dear colleague, Anani Gizenyo, was there in spirit and is certainly here with us today. Hence, today's public lecture is not a defense, but rather a presentation of Watu's dissertation. He will take approximately 35 minutes to present from this body of work and answer questions from you, the public. Before he begins, I want to provide a brief intellectual biographical note. Watufani Poe earned his bachelor's degree from Swarthmore College in Africana Studies and 2 master's degrees in history and Africana Studies here at Brown. His dissertation, entitled Resistant Fragmentation, The Radical Possibilities of Black LGBTQ plus Activism in Brazil and the United States, is based on archival and ethnographic research in Brazil and the United States with external funding support from the Social Sciences Research Council, the Mellon Foundation, the US Fulbright Program, the Tinker Foundation, and the Brown University Brazil Initiative. He has completed a challenging transnational dissertation research project that required him to traverse thousands of miles across Brazilian and US cities to document the political work LGBTQ plus activists and scholars across the Americas are doing. It is still rare, I consider, to see scholars with this kind of deep commitment to understanding the intersections of gendered racial oppression and the various forms of social movements that have emerged to dismantle that violence from a diasporic perspective. I also have to underscore that I've been very impressed with Watu's intellectual growth over the last 6 years. As Professor Gizenyo wrote in his final letter for Watufani, he quote, "At Brown, he has matured both as a scholar and in the making, a scholar in the making, and an activist who's fully capable of translating lessons from activism into viable theory," unquote. Anani and I always discussed how this kind of transnational feminist research on Black queer politics in 2 of the most significant countries in the African diaspora is very rare and should be nurtured. And it is my hope that he will also nurture the next generation of scholars doing this work. Anani also wrote in his letter, quote, "Showing a deep and impressive familiarity with both geopolitical contexts, Watu marshals national histories and developments to elucidate the persistence of the political call for social change that attends to gender and sexuality in social, cultural, political attitudes and practices," unquote. Anani would certainly have been proud to see the completion of this dissertation, especially the fact that he did not give up on the comparative project, even though so many scholars told him it would be difficult and near impossible. However, he stayed true to the transnational feminist and diasporic frame of the project, especially the serious engagement with scholarship produced in Portuguese by Brazilians, which we all agree will be his most important contribution. In the fall of 2021, I'm proud to say that Watufani will begin his career as a postdoctoral fellow at Amherst College and then as a professor at the University of Pittsburgh in 2022. So I want to begin by saying congratulations again on this dissertation to Watu. And I know that you will carry on the Africana intellectual tradition, and especially and go on to be a leader in terms of a transnational feminist scholar and teacher. So Watufani, the floor is over to you. And on May 2nd, I encourage all of you to join us in the graduation, where he'll be officially Dr. Watufani Poe. Thank you, Watu.
Thank you so much, Kishkan. I don't think I was ready for that, that intro. Thank you so much for those words and for bringing Professor Zizenyu into the room. Okay, I'm gonna quickly share my screen and we'll get started. Okay. So, like my advisor, Dr. Perry said, this is just going to be a general overview of my dissertation now that I passed the defense, and give you all an idea of the kinds of work that I've been working on these past 6 years throughout the dissertation process. So my dissertation is entitled Resisting Fragmentation, the Radical Possibilities of Black LGBTQ Activism in Brazil and the United States. And to give an overview of this presentation, I'm gonna start with an introductory story from my fieldwork that explains the title and central theoretical framework of resisting fragmentation. Then I'll launch into my central arguments for my project. I'll talk a little bit about my geography and my methodology for the project. Then I'll do a rundown of the chapter structure and the main arguments of each chapter. And then I'll talk a little bit about my future research, where I see this research going. December of 2018, São Paulo, Brazil. I arrived at the apartment building drenched in sweat. I miscalculated that although the apartment building in downtown São Paulo was close to where I stayed in distance measurement, it was up a steep hill. In conjunction with the city's hot and muggy December heat, this incline made my appearance less than presentable than I desired for an interview. I took my sweaty looks in stride. Besides, others undoubtedly suffered from the same summer heat in December as well. When I arrived at Felipe and his partner Gilles' apartment, I received a cold glass of water and the simple question, "Some heat, huh?" Taking note of my implied response to Felipe's question to my sweaty appearance, we all burst out into laughter. After sitting and cooling off for a second, Felipe and I launched into conversation. I had run into him various times before the interview took place, but our schedules always conflicted when we tried to set up an interview. However, every time I ran into Felipe, his undying commitment to Black LGBTQ community building was more than apparent. The first time I saw Felipe was from afar was during the annual Todos os Gêneros, All of the Genders Festival at Itaú Cultural Center in São Paulo. The festival generally focused on themes related to gender and sexuality. That year, the focus was on communities living with HIV. Felipe presented an experimental dance examining what it means to be Black and HIV positive in Brazil. Following his piece, he participated in a panel discussion with 4 other Black LGBTQ HIV positive activists, discussing the difficulties of being both Black and HIV positive and the importance of centering the conversations of race and Blackness in the public health field. The next time I saw Felipe was in São Paulo's Pride weekend in 2017, when the collective he helped start, Festa Amém, threw the first São Paulo Black Pride party at a club in the center of São Paulo. I was continually in awe of Felipe's dedication to Black LGBTQ and HIV positive communities. His articulation of community importance beyond borders and across the diaspora spoke powerfully to me and my dissertation project. I was excited that we could finally sit down and talk more than 2 years after our first encounter. When Felipe began to talk through his activism and community building experience, he described it as a complicated piecing together of seemingly disparate pieces of himself. Felipe explains, quote, There was this fragmentation of my sexuality. I came out as gay within the hip hop scene, and that was a lonely experience too. Inside a community that welcomed me when it came to aesthetic, sound, and dance, but the affective side was always left out. I had my first boyfriend in 2012, and he was part of my dance group, so I opened up to everyone in the group in early 2012 and 2013, and everyone knew, but it was always treated with tolerance. As long as you aren't feminine or don't talk about it or show it, we accept it or tolerate it. So there was this huge silencing process and fragmentation. So here I did hip hop and I was somewhat myself. And then I looked for the affective fulfillment in other places. I looked for people in LGBT parties, saunas, this issue of looking for places to explore your sexuality in spaces and in silence and in darkness. But this intersection and this conjunction began when I met other people when I met other people that had this construction of self that crossed mine, dance/hip hop and sexuality. It was there that I began to distance myself. I distanced myself from dance for a while. I worked in a bar, and through this process of working in a bar, I started to throw a party in this bar that I worked at. And the party was Festa Amém. So for as long as I remember, I always dreamed of having a gay hip hop party where I could partake in the culture, the music, and the aesthetics that I wanted without being exotified. In 2016, Feshtaming begins this process to connect the dots of myself, to get in touch with with the community. I think in this process, I begin to understand myself as a Black gay person. End quote. So for Felipe, the separation of parts of oneself or fragmentation forces Black LGBTQ people to silence parts of themselves to make those in the communities they belong to feel comfortable. But this silencing of parts of themselves only leads to making supposed community spaces unsafe for the full expression of self for Black LGBTQ people. For Felipe, hip hop spaces were where he could artistically connect to his Blackness, but those spaces refused his LGBTQ-ness. To find spaces to embrace his sexuality, he searched out LGBTQ social spaces. However, it wasn't until he discovered other people who share the intersections of Blackness and non-heteronormative sexuality that he could connect the fragmented pieces of himself. Felipe reiterated the importance of this connection with other Black LGBTQ community members through his excitement about Black trans São Paulo-based singer Linda Quebrada's 2017 hit, Bicha Preta. Bicha, sometimes spelled with an X and sometimes spelled with a CH, Preta, is a sometimes derogatory term aimed at Black gay and trans femmes in Brazil that Black LGBTQ communities have reclaimed as a powerful moniker of the Black gay and trans community. Felipe tells me, quote, "These conversations are still new. It's a discussion that found profundity in 5 years. So when Linda Quebrada comes out singing Bicha Preta, we think, wow, someone is me," meaning all of these issues about Black LGBT people. But it was always separated in the past. I remember people used to say that there aren't Black gay people because if you're gay, you're gay. You stop being Black. So that there is this issue of taking away your Black identity because of relating homosexuality to whiteness. So it was a common thing in the Black community, end quote. So Felipe draws attention to the importance of moments like Linda Quebrada's, focusing on the struggle and power of Bichas Pretas in her song, or the creation of spaces that center Black LGBTQ people, which provide refuge from the fragmentation that other Black or LGBTQ community spaces force upon them. These Black LGBTQ spaces refute the constant erasure that Felipe calls attention to by declaring Black LGBTQ issues as both Black and LGBTQ issues. These geographies of Black LGBTQ community building work to resist identity fragmentation. The central argument of my dissertation revolves around this theoretical framework of resisting fragmentation that Felipe outlined. I analyzed the Black LGBTQ activism that I witnessed across Brazil and the United States as a continual process of resisting fragmentation, both within social movements and in larger society. I define Black LGBTQ resistance and activism as a daily individual and community survival practice, given the daily violences Black LGBTQ people face. I focus on these instances of Black LGBTQ protagonism across various sites, such as the organization of online support groups for the Black LGBTQ community, advocacy for political rights for Black and LGBTQ people, the creation of dance parties and spaces for corporeal freedom for Black LGBTQ people, and many more. I argue that Black LGBTQ self-making and community-making processes of resisting fragmentation work not only to shift larger movements for social justice, such as Black racial rights movements or LGBTQ advocacy movements, but this resisting fragmentation also works to refuse the systems of domination that force restriction and fragmentation in Black LGBTQ people's lives. Therefore, in their journey to create spaces where Black LGBTQ people can be whole, they work towards alternative futures where they can find freedom from domination and fragmentation. In my approach of analyzing these moments of Black LGBTQ activism, I present the radical transformative possibilities within their self and community making journeys, while simultaneously presenting the ever-present limits to these possibilities from the systems of heteropatriarchy, capitalism, and white supremacy that work to control and destroy the radical imaginations of Black LGBTQ activists. So I want to talk a little bit about my methodology and geography before I launch into the structure of my dissertation, my theoretical interlocutors. So my project, as I've said before, is an ethnohistoric project. And what that means is it's an intersection of both ethnographic method and archival method. I made heavy use of ethnography, participant observation, semi-structured interviews, and focus group interviews across urban sites throughout Brazil and the United States. I also made use of archival research. Two of the main archives that I spent a lot of time in is the SEDOC archive, which is a digital archive by the Grupo Dignidade in Brazil, an LGBTQ archive. And then the In the Life archive, the Black LGBTQ archive in the Schomburg Center in New York. But I also made use of folks' personal archives because a lot of the information that I found about Black LGBTQ communities were actually held in personal archives by Black LGBTQ folks who had held documents throughout the years. So, but then I also use social media archives as one of my major archives because lots of my preliminary research showed that social media served as a catalyst to begin many of the Black LGBTQ social and political spaces that I actually focused on in this project. And then a final note about geography. So Keisha Khan talked a little bit about this in the introduction, but the rationale for choosing these two sites for my research is due to three core reasons that I elaborate upon in my introduction to my dissertation. So my first reason is demographics. Brazil and the United States hold the two largest Black populations outside of the continent of Africa. Brazil, with almost 54% of the country's total population classified as Black, and the last site in the Americas to abolish slavery in 1888, holds the largest Black population in the Americas, followed by the United States. Then two, country size. Brazil and the United States also represent two of the largest democracies in the Americas. The United States with about 320 million inhabitants, and Brazil with about 205 million inhabitants. Although nowadays I'm weary of calling either the United States or Brazil a democracy, and that's a longer conversation that we can have in the Q&A, but that's just my personal feeling. And then three, political and institutional histories. Due to histories throughout the 20th and 21st century of the United States meddling and extending undue influence in the political affairs of Brazil, the systems of white supremacy, capitalism, and heteropatriarchy in place in the two countries are constructed and reformulated directly in conversation with one another. And I talk a lot about this in terms of thinking about the processes of the military dictatorship in the 1960s through the 1980s in Brazil, and the role the United States played in that. And then also thinking through this moment of Trump and Bolsonaro and how that also plays into the ways in which these systems of power are reformulated in conversation with one another in both countries. So for these core reasons, the Black queer diaspora between these two countries serves as a rich site for relational research. Finally, before I talk about my chapter structure, I want to talk about the theoretical interlocutors that I'm using for this project. And the theoretical interlocutors I put into three large categories. So my first category is intersectionality and Black feminist thought. Some of the authors that I use in this category are folks like Kimberly Crenshaw, Lelia Gonzalez, Audre Lorde, Jamila Ribeiro, the Combahee River Collective, Barbara Smith, amongst many others. And what I use this category for is to insert this theorizing of fragmentation into a longer trajectory of themes of intersectionality and multiple oppressions discourse from Black feminist thought. My second category, Black queer studies and queer of color critique, that has authors such as E. Patrick Johnson, Jose Munoz, Sharon P. Holland, Kathy Cohen, Osmundo Pinho, Alex Hodges, amongst many others. And this category really helps me to understand the ways in which the Black queer subject works to destabilize categories and invoke alternative futures. So how are Black queer folks making us rethink what is Blackness, what is queerness, and how are they working towards alternative futures to find the freedom that they need to survive? And then finally, theorizations of Black diaspora and Black queer diasporas. Some of the scholars I use for this category is Abdias do Nascimento, Lucas Veiga, Jafari Allen, Omasheki Tinsley, Tanya Saunders. And what this category really helps me understand in my project is to understand the ways in which systems of power, such as white supremacy, heteropatriarchy, and capitalism, how these systems of power function globally, and therefore the resistances to these systems of power that Black LGBTQ people enact are also global and transnational, and we need to understand the transnational connections between these traditions of resistance. All right, so now I'm going to launch in the structure of my dissertation. What are the chapters and what are the arguments in each chapter? So for my first chapter, Unfragmented, Black LGBTQ Self and Community Making. This chapter analyzes how Black LGBTQ people, both within social movement spaces and in their individual lives, find ways to construct definitions of themselves that center their experiences of oppression at the intersection of multiple systems of power. So the first part of my chapter focuses on the stories of 3 Black LGBTQ HIV positive activists and community workers in Philadelphia and Rio de Janeiro. And 2 of these activists are pictured on this slide, Jean Vinicius from Rio de Janeiro and Abdul Ali Muhammad from Philadelphia, who I think we have in the room. So hey, Abdul Ali, thank you so much for all of your contributions. And so in this chapter, in this first part of my chapter, I outline how these activists resist fragmentation in their own lives and interactions with social movements, bringing forth 3 salient themes. 1, how they construct themselves as all parts at once, always unfragmented. 2, the necessary conflicts that occur due to these activists clash with others in these community spaces who refuse to acknowledge the intersections of multiple systems of power. And 3, the difficulties and isolation that these moments of conflict bring in these Black LGBTQ activists' lives. In the second part of my chapter, I focus on what community construction looks like for Black LGBTQ people amongst themselves. In this section, I focused on the Black LGBTQ party from Brazil, Bachiku, which the larger picture on this slide is actually from a Bachiku party in Brazil, as an example of Black LGBTQ community making. In my analysis of Bachiku, I outlined the themes of community making apparent and the construction of this space and the necessary conflicts with non-Black LGBTQ individuals who frequent these spaces. So for example, at one point in my chapter, I talk about how the organizers of Bachiku work to center Black LGBTQ corporeal freedom, with every party I attended featuring an announcement that so every Bachiku that I attended for my participant observations included an announcement that this space is a Black space and only Black people are allowed on stage near the DJ to dance. And this was really to reinforce a Black LGBTQ and Black corporeal freedom for the space, understanding that this space is centering Black affect, Black freedom. Yet once the party becomes more popular and more non-Black, particularly white, people begin to frequent the party, how this kind of utopic Afrofuturistic space that Bachiku is creating is infiltrated with moments of white supremacist and heteropatriarchal violences. So throughout my chapter, while showing the transformative potential of Black LGBTQ self and community making, I also show the limits in the form of loneliness for Black LGBTQ people who insist on their wholeness, or in the form of white people attempting to recenter themselves in radical Black LGBTQ spaces. In my second chapter, The Journey Home, Black LGBTQ Navigation of Broader Movements for Social Justice, I analyze the involvement of Black LGBTQ activists in social movement and community spaces dedicated to the LGBTQ community or the Black community in Rio de Janeiro, Salvador da Bahia, Philadelphia, and the San Francisco Bay Area. For Black LGBTQ activists who choose one movement over another, Black or LGBTQ, I analyze what drives Black LGBTQ activists out of one movement and keeps them tethered to another. I analyze the sacrifices and silences that still arise for many of them in attempts to authentically remain and exist wholly within these community spaces. Finally, I ask how Black LGBTQ leadership shifts the goals and understandings of power and oppression within these movements. I begin my chapter by analyzing the stories of Wilson Mandela and Hermeval da Hora, the founders of one of the first Black gay groups in Brazil, Adedudu, and their creation of this group within the Movimento Negro Unificado, the Unified Black Movement, in Salvador in 1979. Next, I examine the story of Claudio Nascimento. Oh, and Wilson Mandela is actually this bottom image on the slide, and he has a shirt that's from the Movimento Negro Unificado. He now lives in Rio de Janeiro, so he's active there. Next, I examine the story of Claudio Nascimento and his departure from the Movimento Negro Unificado in the 1980s, and entrance and lifelong involvement in the LGBTQ movement groups in Rio de Janeiro, from Grupo Arco-Íris, Rainbow Group, and Rio Sem Homofobia, Rio without Homophobia. And Claudio Nascimento is this second row of pictures, is the first person in the picture. Next, analyzing the herstory and manifesto of the Black Lives Matter Global Network, founded in Oakland, California, in conjunction with the stories of the Black queer feminist founders, Patrisse Cullors and Alicia Garza, I expand on what Black queer leadership does to the power analysis and movement goals of racial justice movement. And I will quickly say that much of the conversations this year around accountability directed at the founders will certainly make its way into my future manuscript project, but that's not a part of this dissertation chapter as I was writing. I then analyze the silences that some Black lesbian and bisexual women face around questions of sexuality, using the story of Neuza das Dores Pereira and her involvement in the Black women's movements in Rio de Janeiro and the founding of the Casa das Pretas, the Black Women's House. I end my chapter shifting to Philadelphia, utilizing the story of Shania Kila, a co-founder of the Black and Brown Workers Cooperative, to understand how their Black queer-led racial justice movement works to reject the silences around gender and sexuality in the broader Black community in Philadelphia. In my third chapter, Representação versus Representatividade, Black LGBTQ Identity Politics in the Political Sphere, I focus on the question of representational politics and how politicians from the right and the left of the political spectrum fight for or against the communities they represent, focusing on Black LGBTQ politicians. I analyze the writings and news interviews of politicians, as well as some of the interviews I have been able to conduct in person with some of these politicians to gauge their commitment to Black LGBTQ communities. I question the type of representation these politicians embrace and how their politics impact the Black LGBTQ communities they represent. I outline two different kinds of representation in the chapter: representação, a simple form of representation where Black LGBTQ people are entering the political sphere regardless of their politics, and representatividade, a radical form of representation that ensures that Black LGBTQ candidates work politically for the interests of their communities and all those who are oppressed like them. I begin with revisiting the various Black queer feminist definitions of identity politics and representation throughout Brazil and the United States to give a foundation in understanding the uses of identity politics. I then offer two examples of representatividade. Black trans state representative from São Paulo, Erika Maluguinho, who is pictured on this slide in this top picture, and Black trans city councilwoman from Minneapolis, Andrea Jenkins, to show how their work continually lines up with their intentions of representing the interests of and remaining accountable to Black and LGBTQ communities from which they come. I then offer one example of representação from Black gay state representative from São Paulo, Douglas Garcia, and show how he weaponizes his identity to gain political power that he uses then against the Black and LGBTQ communities that he claims to represent. Next, I reflect on the complexity of Lori Lightfoot's mayoral campaign and its impact on working class Black and LGBTQ communities in Chicago, to understand how community impact and the lack of accountability to the communities one represents works against the intention of working towards a representatividade. I end by thinking through the danger and precarity of working towards a radical representational politic, or representatividade, that advocates for vulnerable Black LGBTQ communities by analyzing the city council tenure and assassination of Marielle Franco from Rio de Janeiro. My final core chapter, Black Queer Freedom, the Radical Imaginings of Black LGBTQ People, takes up the question of Black LGBTQ freedom for activists in Brazil and the United States. In the first part of my chapter, I outline 4 striking themes prevalent in the theorizations of freedom for Black LGBTQ activist interlocutors I interviewed. 1, the impossibility or improbability of freedom in the present. 2, the deconstruction of oppressive forces. 3, the freedom to be in all one's complexities. And 4, self-determination. Expanding upon the themes of Black LGBTQ freedom, I analyze the work of 3 Black LGBTQ artists in the second part of my chapter: Janelle Monáe from Kansas City, Missouri, Linda Quebrada from São Paulo, and the Afrobafo Collective from Salvador, Bahia. Interrogating the performance art of these 3 Black LGBTQ artists and collectives, I show how the aforementioned themes my interlocutors presented as crucial to Black LGBTQ freedom are presented in the works of these artists. Outlining both the theorizations of freedom by Black LGBTQ activists and the visual and artistic renderings of that freedom illuminates the various ways Black LGBTQ creators in Brazil and the United States work to imagine and bring forth life beyond the everyday violences they endure. In my outlining of these themes, I take seriously the thought production and theorizations of the interlocutors I cite. In doing so, I aim not necessarily to celebrate the extraordinary thoughts of Black LGBTQ activists who are world-recognized leaders, but rather to resist the centering of a brilliant thought leader and lean into the extraordinary of the Black LGBTQ activist ordinary. My centering of Black LGBTQ activist thought, regardless of education, background, organization connection, awards, etc., aims to show that both the analytic potential of a Black LGBTQ standpoint and the connection between Black LGBTQ thought across the Black queer diaspora. My final chapter offers a personal reflection on the importance of diasporic change for Black exchange for Black LGBTQ communities. Looking back on moments that I shared with Black LGBTQ interlocutors throughout my research and the value that they placed upon being able to learn from different experiences and tactics toward Black LGBTQ freedom, I argue that making our work within Black queer studies and Africana studies global and diasporic at its core is politically imperative. Rejecting hyper US nationalistic Black political and intellectual movements, I argue that we must, as scholars and activists, move toward deconstructing imperialistic nationalisms and work towards global Black solidarity in all of our work. So finally, I want to take a moment to talk a little bit about where I see my research going, where I see the book manuscript project going. So a little bit of the work that I want to do for adapting my dissertation into a book manuscript. One of my first projects for this is a new chapter that looks at the moment of 2020. So you all might have been noticing that I spent a lot more time doing my research in Brazil than I did in the United States. That wasn't intentional, but the coronavirus pandemic in the early 2020 actually ended up cutting off a lot of my US-based research. And it cut off that research during an incredibly important time for Black political activism. And so one of the projects that I want to do is look at the moment of 2020 and the Black uprisings that took place in both the United States and Brazil, and understand what Black LGBTQ leadership and involvement, how that shifted the conversations that were happening in both countries throughout the year of 2020 and the kind of activism that was happening. Some more archival work that I'd like to do to develop my second chapter is really return to the In the Life archive and really use a lot of the Joseph Beam and Essex Hemphill papers to expand on the kinds of reflections that I'm doing in the second chapter on how Black LGBTQ folks are interacting with Black movements and LGBTQ movements. And then I also want to take a moment to return to Brazil to interview Giovanna Baby and some of the early activists in the early trans movement in Brazil, who are largely Black trans women, to understand how are they also thinking through these complexities and navigating the fragmentation of self in these movements, in these early movements. One of the other things that I'd like to do is write another chapter that looks deeper at social media to understand the ways in which social media serves as a bridge, as a connecting force between the Black queer diaspora. So what conversations are possible between the Black queer diaspora because of the social media? And how does that then allow us to think through the connections of the Black queer diaspora, and what are the conversations that are happening across the diaspora? So those are some of the projects that I'm thinking for in terms of taking this research forward for the book manuscript. So I want to quickly say a thank you to absolutely everyone who supported me throughout the years with this project, all the people who allowed me to interview them, to share their stories with me, my committee whose help throughout this project I can't even put into words, because I wouldn't have been able to do this kind of heavy work without the kind of supervision, support from my committee and my community. And then finally, I want to shout out Professor Zizenyo, who passed away before being able to share this final moment with me, but whose contributions to this project and to my own development as a scholar will continually live on. Thank you, everyone, for all of these contributions.
Thank you so much, Watufani, and congratulations again. I've had plenty of opportunities to talk with you and congratulate you. So I'll give the rest of the time to the people, the public present. Anyone have any questions or comments, I'll try to monitor the chat. I can figure out how to use. So just raise your hand, I suppose, if you have a question or comment. And thank you again, James Green. I see is also on the chat, on the call, one of his committee members. Victor Terry, the first hand I see up.
Watu, thank you so much for this. It's very clear that this is a gift to the community, and very much research for, not research on, which leads me to my question. Understanding that it's not uncommon for scholars and researchers to come into Black queer spaces to conduct research. How did you set yourself apart in building these relationships? Because the type of information you've gathered, it's very clear that you've got to know the people you are interviewing very, very closely and built some trust with them. What was your process in building that trust?
That's thank you for that question, Naz. It's such a wonderful question and a difficult question. I think that the work of ethnography is complicated. And I think it's complicated because folks' stories are valuable. Folks' stories are incredibly valuable, especially folks who have passed through difficult moments, who are experiencing systemic violence. Folks' stories are incredibly valuable. So there's a lot of value put into who do you trust with these stories. And I actually had multiple experiences of folks telling me that, I've received many requests to have interviews about this subject, about my life experiences, and I've actually said no. And I decided to say yes to you because of the kind of politic that you are bringing to your work, because of your identities, because you're Black, because you're queer. And so I think that I understood that there was a huge responsibility that folks placed into me, placed on my shoulders because of that trust that folks allowed. But I think that in terms of thinking about how did I go about gaining that trust, a lot of that comes to kind of my own politic around interacting with activist communities. That comes from my experience as an activist, which is about, it's not just an experience of taking stories. It's an experience of exchange. So when I talk about exchange is important in the Black queer diaspora in research, is that I also allowed myself to be interviewed. And sometimes I allowed myself to be interviewed before I got to the interview. And that was partially to be able to let folks know that I could be a potentially safe person for them to share their story with, that I was not going to misuse their story, mischaracterize their story in ways in which they didn't want. But it was also a kind of want to be able to share tactics. What are your tactics for survival? What are your tactics for Black queer survival? How do we share? How do we grow together? And so the interview was only one portion. The conversation, the exchange was the biggest part of the kind of the experience. And I think one of the biggest parts in terms of thinking about how I gained trust. In terms of how I'm thinking about not trying to be irresponsible moving forward, I think that when I think about being connected to universities, which are institutions that have lots of money, which, as we have seen this week with the news around Penn and Princeton, is that these institutions gain their wealth through Black suffering, through building over working class communities. And so I think that stepping into that, I think that my question for myself is, how do I work to redistribute? How do I work to bring folks into the university space to be the experts on their life and their experiences? And so I'm continually thinking about ways in which I can collaborate with the folks that I've interviewed, with the activists that I haven't interviewed, and make ways for them to be seen as experts within the university space, but also thinking about redistribution of resources. And so those are, I think, two ways that I'm thinking about, ways forward to try and be responsible. because it's a like, I think that it's a continual struggle. The academy is a complicated space. And it's a complicated space when we think about interacting with the stories of oppressed people. So I think that centering that kind of the political work of redistribution and having oppressed people being the experts of their stories. I think that those are two ways in which I want to center going forward as a scholar, as a future professor at these kinds of institutions.
Thank you, Watu. I see that James Green has his hand up, but I also wanted to mention the question from Alexandre in the chat. And he says, the question from Sao Paulo: how do you understand the differences between racial systems in Brazil and the United States, specifically a strong whitening culture, and how that affects the intersectional politics you investigated? There's also a question from Professora Pereira Giselda. First of all, congratulations and best wishes for your next adventure. She says, please use your crystal ball and help us. How do you think the situation in Brazil will move towards the Brazilian community, with an unfortunate possibility of continuity in terms of with the Bolsonaro government? I think those are the two questions that I have noted. And if you can answer that in conjunction with the question that Professor Green will ask.
Thank you, Keisha Khan, because unfortunately I have to slip out to another meeting at 1 o'clock. Watu, I want to first say, I'm so happy you chose to come to Brown for your doctorate. It's really been a pleasure working with you over these years, and see you, you already had a connection to Brazil before you came to Brown, but to see how you've built that connection in profound ways. And I think it's reflected, I was going to actually kind of ask the first question, but you answered it, but I'm going to ask a variation of that. But I must say that the word gets back to me about how respected you are about people in the movement, the LGBTQ movement at least, how sensitive you are to those relations. I also see a person whose last name is Poe. I missed the very beginning of this. I'm assuming that's your father. Is that correct?
You'll probably see a lot of people who are here with
mother and
Poe,
sister and
family.
So, okay, so I want to congratulate an amazing parenting and siblinging, because Watu was just an amazing person, a sensitive, warm person, and a great scholar. He's going to have a fabulous career ahead of him. So clearly it came from really good nurturing by the people around him. So let me just quickly ask a version of the question that was asked before, which is, in spite of your desire, and I know you will do this, what Keisha Khan and others have done is to really make US academia available to Afro-Brazilian scholars, which kind of helps to revert a little bit the power balances and the inequalities between the North and the South. But it still remains, it's just a contradiction there because of the power relations. So how do you see yourself kind of being able to address that beyond, sponsoring a person to come for a Bolsonaro or finding resource money to hire someone to be a research assistant for you? Because it's much deeper than just our individual actions. I'm just curious to know if you've been thinking about that beyond kind of modeling up after what Keisha Khan and others have done to be very generous to Brazilian scholars.
Thank you for that question, Jim. And yeah, I'll answer them backwards, because I think that my answer to your question, Jim, is a little shorter than my answer to the other questions. I think it's interesting having just come from being on the job market, and a lot of the conversations that I'd have with folks when I was interviewing in terms of the kinds of collaborations that I'd like to do on certain campuses were around these kinds of questions. So these were at the front of my mind. So I was thinking about the kinds of work that the Brazil Initiative at Brown has been doing, kinds of work that Anani and Keisha Khan really did in Africana studies at Brown to bring Black Brazilian scholars and activists to Brown. And I think that kind of work is a little understated, especially when we understand the political situation of Brazil. So the fact that recently created programs, Black studies programs in Brazil, have been attacked by right-wing government because these are public programs, and public programs are funded by the government. And so understanding the ways in which the Bolsonaro effect has had a huge effect in terms of the researchers of Blackness in Brazil, but specifically Black researchers of Black Brazil in Brazil, this right-wing wave has had a huge effect on these people being able to be able to research, to find funds to research. And so these kinds of opportunities, providing opportunities for folks to be able to come to the United States to do Bolsa Sanduichi, and not just one person, but collectives of people who are interested in doing this work together, to providing those opportunities, then allows folks to be able to do their doctorate in the United States in ways in which being able to do that doctorate in Brazil are being cut off because of these right-wing funding cuts around questions of Blackness, around a kind of certain kind of political projects. And so I think that it's not understated, it's understated the ways in which making opportunities for Black Brazilian scholars and Black Brazilian activists to be able to come to the States, to take advantage of the funding that is here, that is connected to these kinds of fields. Many of the folks who have contacted me over the years who are interested in getting tips on how to come to the States, they're interested in being connected to Africana studies programs because they understand that their options for doing that in Brazil are few. And so I think that is an incredibly important question when we think about redistribution of resources, because it's not that, you know, the United States has the best scholars on Africana studies or the Black world. It's a question of funding. And so I think that when I think about redistribution of resources, that's one of my main ways in which I'm thinking through what are ways in which I can think about the kind of restructuring to make these things accessible to Black Brazilian folks. Because I understand that being able to go to Brown, being able to have the resources that allowed me to go to Brown also is a certain kind of privilege. So how do we think about redistribution of resources now that I have passed through this experience? So that's my first response to your question, Jim. Okay, the questions from Alexandre and Professora Pereira. Okay, so thinking through the differences in racial systems in the US and Brazil, this is actually a common question a question that I've gotten. The kind of answer that I think that I'm thinking through is to understand that, Alexandre, you know that racial construction in São Paulo is different than a conversation around racial construction in Salvador, or racial construction in Minas Gerais, in Ceará, is that race in Brazil, racial movements, the politics of race in Brazil are heavily regional. And that's not very different from what happens in the United States. Politics around race are heavily regional in the United States as well. Now, things like social media, news has changed, has made it so that, you know, these things seem a lot more standard, homogenous across the nation. But these kinds of concepts change by place to place. And so what I'm understanding when I think about the kinds of differences in racial constructions in the United States and Brazil, I'm also thinking about the different kind of regional racial constructions in different places. And so what that means is that I'm already dealing with, when I'm thinking about the United States, when I'm thinking about Brazil, I'm dealing with a myriad of kind of constructions of race, of racial conversations. And so for me, it's that when I'm thinking about juxtaposing the United States and Brazil, one of the things that I'm also trying to work against is a kind of homogenization of the understandings and the histories of race in certain kinds of region. And understanding that, you know, if I'm looking at Philadelphia and Atlanta, that's also looking at drastically different kinds of situations as much as looking at Salvador and Sao Paulo, or Sao Paulo and San Francisco Bay Area would be. And so I think that that's one of the things that I think that I'm trying to do with the project, is kind of destabilize a kind of homogenization of race across nation. Because I think that that's where, you know, someone like thinking about the problems of something like Gilberto Freire's understanding of race in Brazil, or people using Gilberto Freire to understand race in Brazil, is a problem, because one, Gilberto Freire was understanding race from a white upper class perspective from Pernambuco, which is very different from the perspectives throughout Brazil. And he was understanding this, contrasting with his experiences in Texas in the United States in the 1930s. And so when we do these kinds of homogenizations to understand what is it like in the US, what is it like in Brazil, I think that's when we get to kind of problems around thinking through comparison. And then finally, Professora, I am hopeful that with the recent news around Lula being able to run for president, I am hopeful that that is a more that is a better option, that is a better future that will be opened up. I don't believe that Lula is the solution, but I do believe that Bolsonaro will not, another term of Bolsonaro will not be good for anybody. And I do think that, and I've had a lot of conversations with folks over the years about how, you know, another Lula presidency would help to kind of bring back social programs. But I think that one of the problems is that we need to interrogate the fact that Brazil is a country that has a Black majority and has never had a Black president, has never had and so Lula brings a certain kind of perspective because he comes from a working class background. He knows what it's like to suffer as a working class person, but that doesn't translate into understanding what it means to be a working class Black person. And so I think that, you know, when I think through what the future holds, I would hope that Lula gets elected. And then I'd hope that all of these conversations around representation, around identity politics that are happening in Brazil translate into the left really embracing identity politics in a real way. And the left stopping stop being a barrier to understand, to incorporating kind of radical Black identity politics, like what we saw, what happened in Salvador with the campaign for a Black woman mayor of Salvador. So I think that the left really needs to have a come to Jesus moment about what's going wrong, about the ways in which it's fighting with identity politics, not in a good way. So it's not just that Lula gets to be president for this next round, but it's that a kind of rethinking about who can be president of Brazil, who can be a representative, who can be a politician within Brazil. That's a difficult. So that was a complicated answer to your very difficult question, Professora, but it's something that I'm thinking about often.
Thank you so much, Watu. And I'm going to just underscore Micah Parker's comment about not only are you going to be a great professor, that the ways in which you internationalize and globalize queer Black movements across the diaspora, translatable and migrant, is astounding. Keep it up. I look forward to your future book. And I just wanted to underscore that one of the main contributions even of Anani's work and the work that a lot of us are doing in Black studies is to always keep the international and Pan-Africanist scope, not just as theory, but as practice in terms of exchange of ideas and ideological and the political work that sustains global Black liberation movement. So I think that's one of the most important contributions that you make, and to continue to internationalize Black studies. So when we think about institutional contribution, it's always to keep political movements and social movements at the heart of Black studies, but also to continue the exchanges, the work that Anani did in terms of bringing together Africa, the Americas, Brazil and North America, et cetera, is to continue to make this work international and political. So I think that's really important. So thank you so much for that comment, Micah and others. We have, just to be respectful of people's Zoom fatigue and another event happening right after, I'm gonna ask to take Joshua and Cassie's questions, and then if you can respond as quickly as possible so we have time to, one, celebrate you, and two, move on to the next event. So Joshua? Yeah.
Hi. First of all, Watu, congrats. Your work is amazing. You've opened so many doors for myself and others. Just wanted to put that affirmation in the room. So many others have already done that. So one of the things, I mean, I love a lot about your work, but one of the things I really appreciate is how seriously you take performance as like a way of talking about politics. So mentioning Bachiku and Afrobafo, which are collectives that I've also like worked with and got to know during my time in Brazil. So I guess like in a different vein, I'm really interested, and we've kind of talked about this, but I would like for you to like elaborate a little bit more on it. But with everything that's happening on Big Brother Brazil right now, and that has been happening on Big Brother Brazil right now, in particular with like the kiss between Gil and Lucas, and then like also with João being voted off recently. I was wondering if you could talk about not just Big Brother, but like, you know, like media and like performance and like these reality shows, right? As the space where like, you know, anxieties around Black queerness and like variety of forms of like, you know, gender, sexual expression come up, and like how that's potentially connecting back to like what you were talking about with representação and representatividade. Yeah, I could go on, but I think you kind of already get where I'm going with that. But congrats again. Thank you so much for sharing your work and light with us.
And Cassie, if you could ask your question as well.
Thank you. Watu, I am so thrilled and so proud of you. And oh my God, I can't state enough how magnificent this contribution is. So speaking of contributions to the field, I'm wondering if you're thinking through critically the state of like Black feminist theory right now, the way that it's applied, the way that it's been institutionalized. I would say that we're probably all thinking about its misuses towards capital, towards celebrity, towards all of these things. And at the same time that those very things, institutionalization, celebrity, are ironically giving voice or uplifting other types of Black feminist iterations. So a key example is the way that US Black feminist work is being promoted in Brazil, sometimes elevating the work of Black Brazilian feminist OGs, and at the same time, sometimes marginalizing those very same works. So I'm wondering, where do you see first the responsibilities of Brazilian scholars in the US navigating that work? And then I think my second question is, where do you see the field being transformed through the types of interventions that you're making?
Oh, wow. Thank you for those questions, Josh and Cassie. And I'm so excited that you all are here and that you all are my future colleagues. Okay, so to start with Josh's question. So this is actually something that I've been thinking about a lot, and thinking about when I'm writing about this moment of 2020, that, you know, it's going to be impossible not to include this last section of Big Brother Brazil, because of the ways in which, you know, everybody's been talking. There was so much excitement when you saw all of these Black folks, people who were seen as like celebrity Black activists, who were on Big Brother this season. But a lot of activists who were seeing this come out were all already being like, this is not going to end well. And what folks have seen after this has gone down is that folks are interpreting that, you know, the production company of Big Brother knew what they were doing when they were putting these specific people in the same rooms together. And it was really about silencing these conversations around identity politics, which have gotten to, which have caught hold in Brazil, which have become popular in Brazil. And so much of putting these certain kinds of Black activists or Black political faces, not unfiltered, but filtered through the eyes of the Big Brother production team, putting them on screen like this, was really about to silence this movement against a kind of recent push towards identity politics in Brazil that the right was the right was trying to find new ways to silence. So that's what I'm reading. What happened in this kind of recent session of Vibra de Brasil, and I think one of your questions around the performance the performance of the body, the performance of certain kind of Black politics that happens on this show. It's so interesting to think about when we think about the ways in which folks then use these moments to be like, well, that's why, activists should just shut up. That's why, like when you're a militante, you're just annoying. Folks use these certain kinds of performances as excuses to then go back on these very old, very established Brazilian traditions of racial democracy. I think that it's really a kind of the ways in which we're seeing racial democracy survive. So the ways in which, okay, now we have these new discourses around identity politics that have all kinds of political cachet within the mainstream. So how do we find new ways to shut these people up? And I think that these kinds of situations provide new ways for white supremacy through the lens of racial democracy to continue to adapt and survive. So that's like my first kind of reflection on this, but it's something that I'm thinking about heavily when I think about this chapter that I'm writing on 2020. Cassie, your question around Black feminist theory. Yeah, so I mean, I think one of the books that I'm most, that I've been obsessed with recently has been Jennifer Nash's book on intersectionality, which I think is complicated. Folks have different kinds of reactions to this book. But I think that one of the ways in which I latch onto it is that it shows the ways in which radical Black feminist thought has been commodified, and has been commodified especially by the academy. And so how do people then use intersectionality as this kind of, conversation around diversity? It's not what intersectionality is talking about. And so I think that we're in this moment where we've been with these with these Black feminist discourses for a good amount of time, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we've read them. And that doesn't necessarily mean that we've actually sit with what they're trying to say. And so I think that in this moment, like what is it that we need to do? I think one of the ways in which Black activists or Black scholars from the US, one of the critical works that we can do is participate in the process of translation. So all of these translations, both of Black feminist scholars work in Brazilian Black feminist scholar works into English, and English Black feminist scholarship into Portuguese, and all various languages in between. I think that that's incredibly important because we live in a social media age where folks share quotes from things without reading the whole text, and especially in these moments of it's easier to translate a quote. And that then makes these things accessible across the diaspora. But what's the problem when we don't translate the whole work, when we don't have the whole background? Who wrote this? What were the context that they wrote this in? What does the whole text say? So I think that we need to participate in the radical politics of translation. I think that's the first work. And then we'll be able to return to what these original works say. And so that when we're having conversation about what Black feminism actually is, we can return to the work. We can return to the texts. We can return to what the person said. So I think that's the work that I've seen, that's what the work that I've seen folks really engage in already. So I think that that's the direction that we need to go. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much.
First, I want to say, to close again, it's an important project of translation as well as citation and serious engagement with these ideas. If we're really serious about any sort of global Black intellectual project or radical tradition, we have to read and take seriously the ideas that the majority Black population in Brazil is producing, right? So I think that's really important. And I just want to close and say that in one of the last interviews that Anani gave to a historian, a student at Northwestern, he said that one of his proudest moments at Brown as a teacher over 40 years is the amount of students he convinced to learn Portuguese, and thinking about how transformative that was as a pedagogical practice, and how that transformed the field in terms of African diaspora studies. And we're talking about the amount of Black scholars who have now been trained, and even white scholars who have expanded the field of Brazilian studies. So I would want to add and say that learning Portuguese and learning other languages of the African diaspora, of course, is extremely important. So I want to, again, take this moment, if we can turn on our cameras, and if you want, no pressure, but certainly show solidarity with Watufani and congratulate him. And again, on May 2nd, it will be quite official. He'll become Dr. Watufani Poe and add to our great list of wonderful scholars coming out of the Africana Studies program at Brown University. I am so proud, and I know that he'll go on to be great and continue to represent us all and continue the movement in terms of the scholarly work and political work. So congratulations. Yay!